When we think about silence, we often mistake it for nothingness, for weakness, for the absence of power. But silence, in its deepest form, is not a void. It is a mirror, and it reflects back to others the truth of their own actions. It forces confrontation, not with you, but with themselves. And that is precisely why it hits so hard. When someone wrongs you, insults you, betrays you, or seeks to pull you into the mud of conflict, they expect words. They expect your protest, your anger, your attempt to argue. They expect noise. Because noise, even in the form of anger, provides them cover. It gives them something external to focus on, a distraction from the weight of their own behavior. But when you withhold words, when you stand firm in silence, you strip them of that shield. You leave them alone with the truth they'd rather not face. This is the essence of responsibility. Because silence, when it is conscious and deliberate, is not passive. It is the refusal to participate in lies. It is the refusal to grant energy to chaos. To remain silent is to say, without speaking, I will not carry your burden for you. And that cuts deeper than any insult. In that moment, you become a mirror, and the other person cannot escape their own reflection. That is why silence has a weight. It imposes accountability where otherwise there would be none. Now, why does this strike so profoundly? It's because human beings are deeply uncomfortable with facing themselves. We prefer distraction. We prefer rationalization. If someone points out our flaws, we can argue back, we can defend ourselves, we can fight. But silence offers nothing to wrestle with. It provides no escape route, no justifying story to cling to. It leaves the mind with only one companion, the uncomfortable awareness of its own culpability. And that's why silence can echo louder than shouting. It doesn't dissipate, it lingers. This is why parents, for example, sometimes discover that a quiet look of disapproval impacts a child more than yelling ever could. Because yelling releases the pressure. It gives the child something external to resist, a battle to fight. But silence forces reflection. The child has no one to push back against. They're left to wrestle with themselves. The same principle applies in every relationship, whether personal, professional, or societal. If you refuse to dignify dishonesty, cruelty, or manipulation with a verbal response, you take away the easy escape. You allow the truth to stand unaccompanied, undeniable. But let's be clear, silence in this sense is not avoidance. It's not cowardice. It's not turning away from responsibility. Quite the opposite, it's stepping into it. Because to remain silent when you should speak is weakness. Yet, to remain silent when words would be wasted, when words would only enable more lies, more excuses, that is strength. It takes restraint to not lash out. It takes discipline to withhold the immediate satisfaction of verbal retaliation. But that discipline transforms silence into something potent. It becomes not an absence, but a presence. Not weakness, but power. Think about this in terms of relationships. When someone expects you to beg, to argue, to plead, and you do not, it unsettles them. Because the silence tells a different story. It says, I will not give you the reaction you seek. I will not shoulder the responsibility you're trying to shift onto me. I will let you face yourself. And that is the hardest confrontation of all. For many, it's unbearable. But that's the point. Sometimes the only way a person truly sees the consequences of their behavior is through the silence of those around them. Philosophically, this connects to the idea of truth itself. Truth doesn't require your defense. It stands regardless of whether you shout it from the rooftops. And when you choose silence in the face of manipulation, what you're doing is allowing truth to do its work without interference. You're refusing to obscure it with noise. And often, that is the most responsible thing you can do. Because the truth has a weight, and silence makes it heavier. Psychologically, silence also carries another message. It communicates boundaries. By not engaging, you're stating without words that your dignity is not up for debate. That you will not lower yourself into the chaos of pointless argument or the futility of justifying what doesn't need justification. Silence establishes a wall, not of anger, but of strength. And ironically, that wall communicates more loudly than any speech. But remember, silence has to be intentional. If it's motivated by fear, it collapses into weakness. If it's avoidance, it becomes complicity. But if it's chosen deliberately, if it's grounded in responsibility and in truth, it becomes one of the most powerful tools you have. And that is why it hits the hardest. Because people can ignore your words, but they cannot escape the weight of their own conscience when faced with your silence. So ask yourself, where in your life are you giving away too many words? Where are you trying to justify yourself to people who are not listening? Where are you filling the air with explanations that only serve to weaken your stance? Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is to close your mouth and let silence speak. And here is the paradox. You may think silence is emptiness, but when it is chosen with strength, silence is full. Full of consequence, full of truth, full of responsibility. And it forces others to carry the weight that is rightfully theirs. In the end, your silence will not be forgotten, because it is not empty. It is a mirror. And for many, that reflection will be the hardest blow they will ever endure. When you withhold words, when you deliberately choose silence, you are not simply refusing to speak. You are shifting the entire psychological landscape of an interaction. Human beings are wired to expect dialogue, to expect explanation, to expect the noise of justification. We live in a culture that is addicted to words used to soften, to rationalize, to excuse, to twist, to cover over what is actually happening. And so, when that expectation is not met, when silence steps in, it destabilizes the entire structure of the encounter. It denies the other person the comfort of their usual defense mechanisms. It strips them of the shields they rely on to keep their conscience at bay. And suddenly, they are left in a room with only themselves. That is not a comfortable place to be. Think about how easily we use words as tools of avoidance. We talk in order to delay responsibility. We argue to cover shame. We justify so that guilt does not sit too heavily on our shoulders. Words are like smoke. They obscure the fire of truth burning beneath. But silence clears the air. It offers no distractions, no smoke, no cover. It leaves only the raw experience of the self, and that is why it can feel unbearable. Because what is left unspoken weighs more heavily than any accusation. Psychologically, this works because the human mind is haunted by unfinished business. When a conversation ends with noise, with arguing, with excuses, it feels closed, even if falsely so. Both parties walk away, each convinced of their version of the story. But when a conversation ends in silence, it does not feel finished. It lingers. It festers. It demands to be revisited internally, again and again. That's why silence can follow a person far beyond the moment, echoing in their thoughts long after the event itself has passed. Words fade. Silence reverberates. And this is precisely why silence can be more punishing and more transformative than speech. Because it cannot be contested. If you accuse someone with words, they can defend themselves with words. If you blame them, they can counterblame. If you shout, they can shout louder. But if you are silent, there is no opponent to battle. There is no argument to dismantle. There is no noise to drown out the truth. They're forced into an uncomfortable confrontation with themselves. And that psychological burden can be far heavier than anything you could have said. This is also why silence is often misinterpreted. People fear it. They call it cold, or cruel, or manipulative. But the truth is that silence only feels cruel because it is effective. It bypasses the external battle and pierces directly into the internal one. It denies the luxury of avoidance. And very few people can sit comfortably in that space, because to sit in silence is to sit with one's conscience. And the conscience is relentless. Consider how this works in relationships. Someone wrongs you, perhaps lies to you, perhaps disrespects you, and they expect a response. They expect shouting, tears, endless questions. Because those things give them something to hold on to. They can say, well, you overreacted, or you misunderstood. But if instead they are met with silence, with composure, with a refusal to explain or justify, they are robbed of that escape. They are left instead with their own knowledge of what they did, and with the silence pressing it against them like a weight they cannot drop. That is why silence so often leads to regret. Because regret grows in the soil of solitude, not in the noise of conflict. But there's something deeper here. Silence is not merely a psychological weapon, it is also a moral stance. It is the declaration that you will not participate in the distortion of reality. When words are used to manipulate, to twist, to obscure, then silence is truth's ally. Silence says, I will not dignify this with response. I will not play this game. And in that refusal, there is integrity. That integrity has a power that words, no matter how sharp, cannot match. Of course, silence must be handled carefully. It must not be used as a tool of cowardice to avoid responsibility where speech is necessary. There are times when words must be spoken, when truth must be articulated, when silence would be a betrayal of courage. But in the moments where words would only obscure, where they would only feed the cycle of blame and denial, silence becomes the higher choice. It becomes the act that preserves dignity, both yours and, paradoxically, the other person's as well, because it leaves them with the opportunity to face themselves honestly. And that is the gift buried within silence. Though it feels harsh, it is, in fact, an invitation. It is an opening for the other to reflect, to confront what they would rather bury, to change. It is a mirror held up without distortion. They may despise it, they may run from it, but the image remains. And if they are willing, that confrontation can become the beginning of transformation. This is the paradox of silence. It is absence, yet it is presence. It is emptiness, yet it is full of consequence. It withholds, yet it gives because it gives the other person back to themselves, unfiltered, undeniable. And that is why it cuts so deeply. So, do not underestimate the psychological weight of withholding words. Do not think that speaking is always strength, or that silence is always weakness. Silence, when chosen deliberately, is the loudest statement of all. It is the refusal to join in the dance of excuses, the refusal to offer a shield against reality. And because of that, it has the power to leave an imprint that no speech could ever achieve. We often hear people say that silence is weakness, that if you don't speak up, you're being submissive, you're being dominated, you're being silenced. But this isn't true, at least not when silence is deliberate, conscious, and chosen from a position of strength. In fact, silence is one of the purest demonstrations of power you can exercise, because it reveals mastery over yourself. And the first battle any of us must fight is not with others, but with ourselves, our impulses, our anger, our pride. The ability to hold your tongue, to restrain yourself, to refuse to be pulled into noise, that is not weakness, it is strength in its most distilled form. When someone wrongs you, betrays you, mocks you, or tries to provoke you, your natural instinct is to retaliate. You want to respond in kind. You want to match their insult with your own, to let your anger spill out and land on them like a weapon. That's the easy path. But easy paths are rarely strong ones. The harder path, the one that requires discipline and maturity, is to refuse. To not give them the satisfaction of pulling you into the same swamp they live in. That's what silence accomplishes. It keeps you above the mud. It prevents you from reducing yourself to the level of the one who is attacking you. And that is what real power looks like. Because if you can be provoked into shouting, if you can be lured into rage, then you're not in control, they are. Your emotions are steering you, not your reason. They've won before the argument even begins, because they've pulled you off balance. But silence keeps you grounded. Silence says, you cannot control me. I will not let your actions dictate mine. That's the deepest form of strength, not the ability to dominate another, but the ability to master yourself. This is why silence has always been associated with wisdom. The great thinkers, the philosophers, the saints, they weren't loud, boastful, or constantly defending themselves. They understood that words, if wasted, lose their value. They knew that sometimes the most profound statement you can make is not to speak at all. That doesn't mean they never used words. They did, when necessary, but they understood the discipline of restraint. And discipline is strength. Now, this doesn't mean silence is passive. On the contrary, silence is active. It's a decision, a conscious refusal to descend into chaos. Silence doesn't mean you don't feel anger. It means you've chosen not to let anger rule you. And that choice radiates power. Others can sense it. People expect you to lash out when they strike you. When you don't, when you remain composed, their power evaporates. Your silence unsettles them because it communicates something they cannot fight, the fact that you are untouchable in that moment. This principle applies beyond personal relationships. Think about public life, leadership, even negotiation. The person who cannot remain silent, who fills every pause with words, reveals their insecurity. But the person who can sit quietly, who does not rush to justify, who allows silence to stretch, that person commands the room. Everyone else waits, unsettled, wondering what they are thinking. Silence communicates confidence. It tells others, I do not need to prove myself to you. My presence is enough. And that is strength. There's also a moral dimension here. Many people think that if you don't respond to an insult, or if you don't fight back immediately, you've lost. But often when you fight back, you actually lose more. You lower yourself. You become just as bitter, just as petty, just as reactive as the person you're opposing. Silence prevents that. It allows you to maintain your dignity, to rise above, to refuse to let another person's chaos pull you into their orbit. And there's real nobility in that. But this doesn't mean silence is always the answer. There are moments when words are necessary, when truth must be spoken out loud. Yet the strength to remain silent is what gives weight to the words you eventually choose. If you speak all the time, your words lose value. If you speak only when it matters, your words strike with force. Silence, then, is not weakness. It is the very condition that makes speech powerful when it finally arrives. The Stoics understood this well. They taught that the only true freedom is mastery over oneself, because if you cannot control your impulses, then you are a slave to them. Silence, chosen wisely, is an act of freedom. It is saying, I will not be ruled by rage. I will not let the chaos outside dictate the order within. That is power in its purest form. And you can see how this ties into everything we've been discussing. Silence as a mirror, silence as psychological weight, silence as power. It's all connected. Each dimension reinforces the others. And at the core of it all is responsibility. You cannot control the world. You cannot control what others say or do. But you can control yourself. You can choose how to respond. And sometimes the strongest, most devastating response is no response at all. So when you feel the urge to lash out, to justify yourself, to scream so that others hear you, pause. Ask yourself, who benefits from my words? Am I speaking from strength or from weakness? Am I choosing to speak because it's necessary or because I cannot control myself? And if the answer is the latter, then silence will serve you better. Silence is not retreat. It is not surrender. It is the calm presence of a person who knows their worth and refuses to squander it in pointless noise. That is not weakness. That is power, the kind of power that disarms, unsettles, and endures. Silence carries with it a cost, and that cost is precisely why it is so powerful. When you choose silence in the moments when others expect words, it is not without consequence. It lands heavily. It creates a space, and that space is uncomfortable, sometimes unbearable, for those who must live within it. But that cost is not meaningless. In fact, it is transformative. Because silence is never just the absence of sound, it is the presence of consequence. And consequence, when allowed to work, can change a person in ways that no argument ever could. When you withhold words, you leave the other person alone with themselves. And that's not a light thing. For many, it is torment. Because human beings, left with no distraction, no justification, no excuse, are forced to wrestle with reality as it is, not as they wish it to be. Silence strips away illusions. It exposes the weight of truth in its rawest form. And truth, when it's allowed to stand naked like that, is rarely easy to bear. That's why silence wounds. Because it doesn't give the comfort of counterarguments or the numbing relief of noise. It presses reality, directly into the conscience. Now, sometimes that wound hardens people. Silence can crush if they refuse to face themselves honestly. It can drive them deeper into bitterness or denial. But more often than we think, silence breaks people open in ways that speech cannot. Because words, even harsh words, provide escape routes. You can argue with them. You can dismiss them. But you can't argue with silence. Silence lingers. It hangs in the air long after the moment has passed. It follows a person into the night, into the quiet hours, when they can't distract themselves with noise. And in that haunting, in that space where they're forced to sit with what they've done, real transformation can begin. This is why your silence is not simply withdrawal. It is action. It creates the conditions where growth becomes possible. But here's the paradox. It's not always experienced as kindness. In fact, at first, it may feel merciless. To be left alone with yourself, without rescue, without distraction, that can feel like abandonment, even punishment. But in truth, it is an invitation. Because you are saying, without words, I will not interfere in your confrontation with yourself. I will not shield you from what you need to face. You must carry this. And that invitation, if accepted, can be the very thing that reshapes a person's character. Think about how often people only change when they hit rock bottom, when the noise is stripped away, when no one is arguing with them anymore, when no one is rescuing them from themselves. It is in that silence, in that isolation, that the human soul finally turns inward and asks, what have I done?
Who am I?
What must I become? That is the transformative cost of silence. It creates the possibility for repentance, for responsibility, for redemption. And though it is painful, it is necessary. But silence doesn't only transform others. It transforms you as well. Because to remain silent when every nerve in your body wants to scream, when your pride wants to defend itself, when your anger demands release, that takes extraordinary restraint. And in that restraint, you grow stronger. You learn mastery over yourself. You cultivate patience, clarity, and dignity. In refusing to waste your breath on chaos, you preserve your integrity. That cost, denying yourself the immediate relief of expression, becomes the very soil in which your strength takes root. And so silence wounds in both directions. It wounds the other by confronting them with themselves, and it wounds you by forcing you to hold back what is easy in order to choose what is right. But those wounds are not the kind that destroy, they are the kind that forge. They are the kind that deepen character, that produce resilience, that carve truth more deeply into the soul. Now, it's important to understand that silence, to have this transformative effect, must be chosen with intention. If it is avoidance, if it is cowardice, then it carries no power. It simply prolongs the lie. But when it is chosen consciously, when it is motivated by truth and responsibility, it becomes a weapon against falsehood and a tool for growth. That's why it hits the hardest, not because it destroys, but because it reveals. And revelation always costs something. So ask yourself, what is the purpose of my silence? Am I withholding words because I am afraid to speak, or because I know that words would only obscure? Am I silent because I am weak, or because I have chosen strength? That distinction makes all the difference. Because one silence corrodes the soul, while the other strengthens it and reshapes the world around you. When you embrace the cost of silence, you are choosing to step into the realm of responsibility. You are saying, I will not distract you from the truth, and I will not diminish myself in meaningless noise. I will let reality stand, and I will carry the burden of restraint. That choice is not easy. It demands something from you, but it is precisely that demand, that sacrifice, that makes it meaningful. And this is why silence, though it may cut, often heals more deeply than speech. It wounds, yes, but the wound makes room for something new. It breaks down the false structures, the noise, the defenses, and in their place it creates space for honesty, for change, for growth. That is the transformative cost. So, do not underestimate your silence. Do not think it is nothing. It may be the very thing that forces another person to confront themselves for the first time in their life. And it may be the very thing that forces you to master yourself. That is why silence leaves the deepest mark, because it is not merely absence.
It is consequence.
It is responsibility. It is truth, unaccompanied, inescapable, undeniable.